Let me offer you a quick introduction of our three panelists. Yulia Panfil is a senior fellow and director of New America's Future of Land and Housing program. Prior to joining New America, Panfil worked at Amidyar Network, where she sourced and managed property rights investments. Before that, she was a land governance and legal advisor at USAID, where she oversaw USAID's responsible land-based investment practice and led USAID's private sector and donor engagement on land and property rights issues. She previously worked as a corporate lawyer at White & Case, where she focused on capital market transactions as well as on several land rights and indigenous rights projects for the United Nations and other organizations. David Lubell is ICLEI USA's Senior Climate Mobility and Cities Fellow, supported by Unbound Philanthropy. At ICLEI, David supports cities and counties to prepare intentionally for the arrival of climate migrants, particularly those displaced by climate-induced disasters. He supports cities most vulnerable to climate disasters, plan in advance for an equitable recovery from future disasters. Additionally, he connects key actors in the climate mobility and cities ecosystem, helping local governments connect with organizations and institutions in their communities and nationwide with interest and expertise in the topic. And last but certainly not least is Lindsay Bruger. Lindsay is Vice President Resilience at the Urban Land Institute. She leads ULI's Urban Resilience Program to advance real estate industry's understanding of climate risk, catalyze action to reduce vulnerability, and support communities in becoming more climate resilient. She's a licensed architect and passive house consultant. She's worked for over a decade at the intersection of resilience, adaptation, and the built environment, often serving as a subject matter expert supporting organizations and initiatives such as the American Institute of Architects, the National Institute of Building Sciences, the National Institute of Science and Technology, and the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. We're going to lead off with Yulia.
Thanks so much, Ira. And thank you, everyone, for, can you not hear me? Okay, I'm going to lean in a little bit. Thank you for being here today. It's so inspiring to see so many folks working on this receiving cities issue all together. So congratulations for bringing us all together. My name is Yulia Panfil. I'm the director of the Future of Land and Housing program at the think tank New America. And at New America, our program has been working at the intersection of housing and climate change in the US for several years now. We use a framework to look at three distinct populations, although, as we know, it's all interconnected, but three populations whose housing security is impacted by climate change within the US. And that is those who leave, so people who are displaced by natural disasters and other climate impacts, those who stay, so people who are remaining in place either by choice or because they can't leave in the face of climate impacts, and then those who receive, which is the topic of our conversation today. And we do a mix of research and policy work and also local on-the-ground engagement and capacity building with local leaders. So we do a little bit of the think and a little bit of the do. And I apologize in advance. I think in the conversion from Google Docs to PowerPoint, some of the formatting got a little bit messed up. But this is review, I think, for everyone here, but we estimate that over the coming many decades, several decades, about 20 million Americans will relocate due to climate impacts. To arrive at that number, we take Matt Hauer's 13 million number from sea level rise, and then we add things like wildfires, extreme heat, and so on. And what we're also seeing is that this is already beginning to happen. The Sun Belt population boom has come to a halt. There was a late 2024 study from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco that found that the population inflows to the south are beginning to reverse and people are leaving. First Street Foundation has found that already more than 3 million people have relocated away from flood zones. So we are seeing that this movement is happening, but as was stated at the very beginning, the opening of this conference, it's really just a trickle now. And in the coming decade or so, we expect that it will become a flood. And so the question is, what can we do to prepare and put a plan in place before the trickle becomes a flood? So where will climate migrants go? And what we see is that there's a bit of a duality between places that market themselves or are being put forward as climate havens, and then other places that we call safe harbors. And these are really, across the South, regional economic centers that may be slightly more climate resilient than coastal communities and, are economic engines that we see folks moving to. But if I were to actually add one more map here, I would add the places just next door. There's research that shows, there was a study done last year that looked at thousands of buyouts, managed retreat buyouts that have happened over the last decade. And what they found is that the average distance that people move when they receive a buyout is about 8.5 miles away. So people are basically moving to the next town over. And that poses a question of how do we incentivize population movement away from the next town over, and how do we equip receiving destinations to be able to absorb those population inflows? So why aren't people moving where we would expect them to? And, we take as our jumping off point the fact that people are rational actors. And it's not that they are not moving to Duluth because they're uninformed or because they're stupid. It's that, research shows that while climate change is a factor in decisions over where to move, and it is becoming increasingly so, the primary factors that drive mobility and where people move to are jobs, cost of living, and existing social networks. And so I think that the more reasonable question to ask is, how do we work with climate resilient cities and parts of the country to put in place the factors that would make those places more attractive for climate migrants to move to? How do we improve the housing stock? How do we increase job availability, and so on? And so when we look at climate migration, we really see 4 core audiences that we need to be engaging with. The first is, of course, current or prospective climate migrants. And my next slide will talk about some of the strategies that we're exploring for starting a conversation and shaping a conversation with that group. The second is the federal government. As was, I think, Ira, you alluded to this in the prior panel, we see the federal government, maybe not in this administration, but as a major player in putting in place some of those macroeconomic conditions that would allow some of the more climate resilient parts of the country to accommodate climate migrants. The next is receiving cities themselves. How do we have a conversation with cities like Cincinnati and Milwaukee and Chicago and Duluth and Rochester about what climate-related inflows mean for them, what they could mean. How do we frame this as a potential opportunity for economic growth and revitalization? And critically, how do we include in those conversations the more disadvantaged and vulnerable members of those communities so that climate-driven inflows don't cause displacement and climate gentrification, that elite capture that Hannah was mentioning earlier. And finally, the private sector. Back to the point that people move for jobs. We've heard a lot of discussion around how to engage with individuals about incentivizing them to move, but what is the role of companies as potential anchors and drivers of migration by virtue of offering jobs? So communicating to potential climate migrants, something that we've been exploring a little bit more over the last several months is how to take a bit of a behavioral economics approach to try to understand why people are and aren't moving and incentivize them to move. And the example that we've found some inspiration from is the insurance industry. If you think about it, climate migration is a bit of an insurance play. You are undertaking, and I'm talking maybe less about folks who are displaced suddenly by a disaster and people who are, let's say, moving away from Phoenix, Arizona, where it's becoming increasingly hot. You are taking on a short to midterm financial burden, inconvenience, uncertainty for the prospect of long-term safety. It's a little bit like purchasing insurance. And so we've taken a dive to understand how insurance companies, what are sort of the heuristics and behavioral economics approaches that they use to get people to buy insurance. And so what we find is that there are a few behavioral economics concepts that sort of keep people rooted in place or in the now. The first is present bias. That really hot future or, sea level rise is really far away. I really like what's happening here now. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Optimism bias. It won't happen to me. And we see that a lot with, post-disaster when, people are asked why they stay in place. There's this bias that this hurricane won't hit me. And then status quo bias. People are risk averse. People live where they live for a reason. They build ties. They don't want to move away. They like it where they are. So we looked at how the insurance industry sort of, the tactics that it uses to get people to purchase insurance, and we applied them to the frame of climate migration. And the first we found was the related concepts of risk aversion and regret aversion. So how do you compellingly present the case that, by the time you're ready to move, it may be much harder. It may be that your home value is so depressed that it'll be difficult for you to sell it because nobody's going to want to move there. The federal policy hook that could potentially come into play here are relocation incentives that are time-bound. The second is the availability heuristic. So, when people are reminded and see images of the eventuality, often that makes them kind of ingest that reality. I'm losing the word, but internalize is the word that I was looking for, which is why, if you think about those awful insurance ads, they demonstrate the thing that is happening. And, that relates to a lack of information that we see for homeowners in particular in climate vulnerable regions. As probably many of you know, about a third of all states have no flood disclosure laws on the books, which means that you can purchase a home that has flooded 5 times in the last decade, and the seller of that home has no obligation to disclose to you that that home has flooded, and there's very little way for you to find that out. And so, something that we've been advocating for is the passage of flood disclosure laws nationwide. And then finally, herd behavior. This is the idea that once you reach a tipping point where a critical mass have taken an action, it sort of becomes an accepted norm in a community. We see that with anything. I mean, we saw that with masking and vaccines and everything under the sun. So how do you apply that same concept of, can you incentivize a certain critical mass of first movers on the assumption that a large number of second movers will then go? So then the second audience that we think about are receiving communities themselves, receiving cities. And we've been thinking a lot about the narrative of climate migration and population inflow. And as was already pointed out, many of the most climate resilient parts of the country are also ones that have experienced decades of population decline and deindustrialization. So how do we frame the potential for immigration as an opportunity for economic growth? And how do we sort of frame this also as an opportunity to think through and invest now and be a first mover in order to reap the benefits that the Sun Belt saw over the last 50 years as populations flocked there, and that really stimulated the economy across the Sun Belt. So we are actually, we've just launched we're calling it the Great Lakes Resilient Receiving Cities Network, where we will be working this year with 3 to 4 cities in the Great Lakes region. Chicago is the first one where we'll be convening, where we are pulling together members of the community, city planners, local nonprofits, climate scientists, to kind of put this question on the table of what would it look like to plan for population inflows, and start to do some of that scenario planning. And really critically in here, we are including members of those communities who have traditionally been disadvantaged and poor neighborhoods, because really those are the neighborhoods that are going to see some of the adverse impacts. They will be the ones experiencing displacement and gentrification. And so how do you get those voices at the table right up front? And we think that a really key part of preparing cities to receive climate-driven inflows is, no surprise here, housing. What we know is that even in the cities like Detroit, for example, where there's this myth that there is an abundance of housing and you can buy up a home for $1 or $100 or whatever it is, actually, studies show that when you look at habitable units, Detroit is 24,000 units short. And so a lot of these prospective receiving cities have the bones and sort of the housing stock, but that housing stock is not ready for in-migration. It needs to be rehabilitated. It needs to be, new homes need to be built. And all of that costs money and it takes planning. And so something that we have been advocating for is a resilient receiving cities housing program, where the federal government actually designates receiving cities based on a combination of characteristics that might include climate resilience, urban carrying capacity, projected growth, and provides federal funds, incentives, low-cost loans in those cities to be able to build up the housing stock, renovate the housing stock that would be needed to accommodate those population inflows. And there are already examples of these sorts of initiatives, they're just not tied to climate. Even if you think back to the opportunity zones concept, there are plenty of examples across the country where certain jurisdictions are given tax advantage status. And so how do we tie that in with climate resiliency? And then this is my last slide. How do we communicate to the private sector? And maybe it's less about communicating to the private sector, because we actually think that the private sector is already wise to climate-related dynamics and is already making these decisions. But how do we kind of shepherd that along? And the example I want to end with is Micron. So a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, the tech giant Micron announced that they were going to establish a $100 billion chip manufacturing plant in central New York, sort of outside of the Cornell area. And the reason that they chose that area was that there's an availability of fresh water, which is critical for chip manufacturing. It's less exposed to climate impacts. And the state of New York provided them with some nice incentives in order to put their plant there. That plant is supposed to create 50,000 new jobs. So that right there, if we go back to the prior point that people move for economic reasons and for jobs, rather than convincing 50,000 individual people to move to central New York, if you can convince one Micron, who's already understanding that it is in their best interest to locate a long-term investment in an area that is climate safe, then that in turn will create the pull factor that can drive climate migration. So yeah, I will end there. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Yulia. That set me up really well. Let me get my slides up here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lindsay Brugger. I'm Vice President of ULI's Urban Resilience Program. If you're not familiar with ULI, anybody not familiar with ULI? Okay. Great, love it. I will share a little bit. So we are a global nonprofit focused on responsible land use and sustainable development. We have over 45,000 members who are active in the real estate and land use sectors. And so I share that because that's really the lens that I'm going to be bringing to the conversation today. I'm going to be talking about how policy and design, as it relates to the built environment, can help better prepare receiving communities for changing populations, and not just for welcoming new residents, but for protecting the long-term residents that are already there. We talked a little bit earlier about how there are some neighborhoods who will receive kind of the brunt of these new residents and may not benefit from it. So we know people are moving. We've been talking about this all day. This is just a stat from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center about forced displacement, 32 million globally in 2022. And that's in addition to those who are recognizing the points that Yulia's mentioned earlier and beginning to make their own choices regarding what is most important to them in safe community. So as we kind of contend with these numbers and we consider where people are going, we need to start worrying about climate gentrification. That's here defined using Jesse Keenan's definition of growing real estate investment, spiking prices for housing and other goods, residential displacement, and demographic changes in areas with lesser exposure to climate risks. And that might look like a lot of things. It's really hard to nail down when gentrification is occurring, but on the screen here are a few characteristics: rising cost of development and taxes, declining social cohesion and political influence, perhaps declining access to employment centers if they're moving, like Micron, to other parts of the country, rising cost of rent, changing demand for the types and goods and services as populations change. The cultural whims of those populations may also change the goods and services, and limited access to facilities and services. And I share these characteristics so that we can begin to understand and recognize climate gentrification when it is or might begin to occur, because that's really the first step in being able to address this phenomenon. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about how policy solutions, investment strategies, and grassroots efforts can work together to help to mitigate climate gentrification-driven displacement. These entities can't do that on their own. I'm going to tee up David a little bit to talk about the ecosystem. We absolutely need to be working together across sectors to think holistically about how we create thriving communities for both newcomers and those who have been there for quite a long time. Some of these strategies might seem fairly familiar to you. Earlier today, when talking about IRA's policy agenda, brownfields were mentioned as something that is not a new concept. I'm going to have many of the same things like community land trusts, inclusionary zoning. These are tools that have been used in communities across the country for a very long time to combat other types of gentrification-driven displacement. And those same tactics can be useful in this climate scenario as well. So one of the tenets of a stable neighborhood is to minimize resident turnover by addressing displacement pressures. And one way to enhance neighborhood stability is through pathways to ownership. So that might look like community land trusts or offering tenants the right of first refusal. The progressive loss of subsidized, affordable, and attainable housing units often occurs in gentrifying communities. And that's in addition to a lack of available funding for the creation of new housing units. So it's really critical to meeting these heightened demands to be able to preserve and expand our availability of resilient, unsubsidized, affordable housing. So you can do that by adopting inclusionary zoning policies or creating housing trust funds that can support a wide variety of available affordable housing activities. You might execute community benefit agreements that hopefully can yield benefits for the community members as well as for the development community, because as was said earlier, we need the private sector to be part of these solutions. I mentioned before that declining social cohesion and declining political influence are markers of climate gentrification. So we need to think about things like community engagement and universal design principles to help ensure access to culturally relevant places and spaces. What does that mean? What might that look like? Well, that could look like space reserved in commercial buildings for historically marginalized business owners or local nonprofits or community organizations. It might look like public open spaces or other community-facing facilities. It might also look like reserved space in commercial tenants for folks who offer affordable goods and services to existing community members. And I know a lot of this sounds like design choices or choices that individual building owners might make, but policy can also incentivize this type of behavior. We saw that in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They have a program that assists the design community in creating more inclusive spaces by providing additional funding specifically to support projects that apply universal design principles. Next, let's talk about constructing and retrofitting our buildings, particularly retrofitting and constructing buildings to minimize energy consumption and to protect them from extreme weather. As we think about how buildings use their energy resources and how exposed they are to our weirding weather patterns. By being proactive, building owners can lower their operating costs. They can reduce rents potentially because they would have a lower costs as far as capital expenditures. They'd also have potentially fewer repair costs if that building is resilient. And of course, all of these things do need to be done carefully and thoughtfully, ideally in conjunction with some of the other strategies I mentioned earlier, because green gentrification can also occur. We want to make sure that the improvements that we're making are available to everyone. But ideally, the regulations, the design standards, and the green building certifications that can help to incentivize this type of behavior can expand opportunity and allow low-income individuals or individuals who have been in a community for a long time to benefit. And that can then be expanded to folks who might be in danger of being priced out. And lastly, we need to prioritize the ease of access to funding for building retrofit, weatherization, and repairs. This isn't always easy to do, especially with existing buildings. So we need to think about offering a broad range of financing options for these improvements, creating more flexible proof of ownership requirements for applicants, especially when we look at things like tangled titles, and then partnering with community-based organizations who are really rooted in the community and have the relationships to facilitate engagement with these types of programs and policies that a government might enact. So I kind of flew through that. Our receiving community, building inclusive places that mitigate climate gentrification displacement report, which you see all the way on the left there, that's available at uli.org/resilience. If you want to dive deeper into these strategies I mentioned, there are multiple examples for every strategy. And then I also have up here a few examples of other reports we've done that relate to this content. We have Reshaping the City, which looks at zoning policies for equity, resilience, and for sustainability. Social Spaces, Resilient Communities dives into the physical hallmarks of space and how those physical interventions can support social cohesion and help create that cultural belonging in a place. And then lastly, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, it's not just us policy wonks that are really watching this space. The private sector knows it's happening. We worked with the investment management firm Heitman 3 years ago now, so this isn't even new to them, on climate migration, assessing that in their investment strategy and what that means for their real estate investment decision making. And the last thing I'll mention is if you enjoyed this content, we do have a summit coming up May 15th in Denver, Colorado. It's adjacent to ULI's spring meeting. If you've ever been to our spring conference, you can attend both events or one or the other. But uli.org/resilience summit will give you all the great information you want to know about it. One of the sessions will be on managed retreat, so this is a topic that we're continuing to talk about with our membership. Great, thank you. David.
Thanks so much. I am now very cognizant of being in the way of everyone's lunch, so I'm going to try to go quickly. But thank you so much to Yulia and to Lindsay. Those were really, really, really great presentations. And also to Ira, adaptation leader, for being leaders in this space and for having us here. As a, one rule around supporting ecosystems is, recognizing them. So I just want to recognize Hannah, who's a really important actor in this ecosystem, for guiding me as I've been learning here, and for your great presentation. Also for mentioning Welcoming America. I'm the founder of Welcoming America and ran it for many years. And also want to shout out to Ali from Cincinnati, who I may mention today quickly, and Scott Preston also has helped me also with this work, and we'll talk about, he will be talking about his project around city certification later. I recommend you check it out. Okay, now that I got that over with, just trying to go relatively quickly. I am with an organization called ICLEI, and for those of you who may not have heard, I'm putting on my timer here, pardon me. I'm again cognizant of the lunch thing. ICLEI is the largest city association in the world that focuses on sustainability, cities leading around sustainability. And I'm with a fellow with ICLEI USA. And I have a unique role. My job really is to act as a weaver of this ecosystem. And when I say ecosystem, I'm specifically talking about cities. And actually, now I remembered I need the slides. Where's the mouse? Okay.
Yeah, it's hiding.
Thanks.
I think if you hit escape, you'll have to do They're not all on one deck. Yeah, this should be down there for you.
Thank you. Okay, now you can see the acronym that I was talking about. Great. And then click, yeah. All right. Well, anyway, yeah, so ICLEI is this association of cities, and my job is supporting the ecosystem of actors working on climate, mobility, and cities. And so we've already talked a lot about the challenges right now, so I'm not going to get too much more into that. But we all know that, yeah, things are coming quickly. And from my role, really, what I'm seeing is, we have this wave coming of people, and not just from outside the US, obviously also from inside the US. And people have talked about this, either we're going to be ready for it or we're not. And I've seen in the immigration space where I come from, the difference between when communities are ready for a large onset of immigrants coming in and when they're not. And it's not pretty when they're not ready. And when they are ready and when they've really planned for it, it's a whole different ballgame, and I've seen that go very well. But it's like anything else. Yuli and I were walking out, we had a coffee and then exiting. I can either plan for going out in the rain, or I can not bring my umbrella and I go out there and I get wet. Like we need to plan. Things go better when you plan. And so how do we plan, and how do we motivate a whole ecosystem to plan? And that's the specialty that I'm focused on, is the role of cities and city level actors. Obviously with the change of administration, the options, as people have talked about on the federal level, are less, but the options on the local level, while they will be constrained somewhat, are a lot more open. The lane is a lot more open. And when I say city level actors, what I'm talking about is not just municipal governments, although ICLEI works primarily with municipal governments, but it's all the actors that could play a role in this ecosystem at the local level and at the national level. And this is sort of the North Star. The idea of having, could we have those dots, all cities filled with resilient, equitable, and welcoming climate mobility infrastructure? Could that be possible? I would say yes, but it would take a lot of work. We don't know how much time we have. But then, people will ask, well, what do we mean by climate mobility infrastructure? And certainly these are topics that everyone so far has spoken about. But the truth is the ecosystem as a whole does not have a definition yet. And I know Adaptation Leader is doing a great job on the receiving community side, leading and trying to define some of these aspects of, if we had the perfect city, the city that was totally ready, what would that look like? What are all the things that we would want to have in place? That hasn't been, that's not defined yet by the ecosystem, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be. And so another question that I was talking about before, why do we need to build this infrastructure and get ready to build this infrastructure now? And I talked about the experience when a community's planned for something or when it's not. This infrastructure, and when I say infrastructure, I mean physical infrastructure, as people have been talking about. The sewers and electricity and all the housing stock, everything that people have talked about, but also more soft infrastructure, which is like having a plan and having programs within the city that are ready to move, or a resilience hub that's ready to welcome climate migrants. So there's a lot to it. We still need to define it, but that's the what. And then the why now is, again, if you build infrastructure, if you think about it like a subway, it's a lot easier to build a subway before everybody's moved in, a subway system or a transportation system. If you wait, as the U.S. did in a lot of cases, it just gets very, very difficult, if not impossible. And certainly on these issues of displacement, with the fear that people have, whether you're coming from far away or even large numbers coming from close by, you don't want to wait. You don't want to wait. Build the subway system now. And so with my work at ICLEI, and before that, I was a consultant to Unbound Philanthropy. My first 5 or 6 months was really just getting to know this ecosystem better, and I'm still learning every day. It's a very, very complex and exciting ecosystem that's developing. One thing that I've seen is that, and I think everyone would recognize this too, there's a thriving ecosystem of actors, academics and researchers and community organizers and everything in between. And so there's national organizations like the organizations that you've heard today that are working on this. There are a lot of community organizations that are working on this. So it's a thriving ecosystem that most people don't know anything about. People in this room know a lot more about than most. So there's the national ecosystem, there's the local ecosystem. There's also an interest from a growing number of municipalities. And how do we support those early adopter municipalities is an important question. We're working a little bit with Ali in Cincinnati on helping them become an early adopter place around experimenting and piloting, as we've heard before, on this topic. And then also there's this local resilience and newcomer welcoming infrastructure that's been built. So there are a ton of cities now that have resilience plans. So they're planning now to make sure that they're ready for weather, but they're not necessarily. And then there's also cities that are part of welcoming, or cities that have offices of immigrant affairs that are more prepared for immigrants. But in general, on the environmental side, sustainability side, cities are more prepared for bad weather to come than they are for people. That's part of the paradigm that's not really there. That needs to be there. And I would argue that there's just a little bit upwards wind that is needed to make that happen. I think we're at the cusp, I really do. And in order to do that properly, we need to respect the fact that there's this ecosystem and figure out how do we support that ecosystem? How do we accelerate the work that people within the ecosystem are already doing? And that's what my charge is, to just to try to be a supporter of the ecosystem whatever way I can. Same with ICLEI in this role. It's not to do it; it's to support all of you that are doing it. And this is a mapping there's a lot more to it. But you can see there's a lot of different nodes in the ecosystem, and I can share this map with anybody who wants it afterwards, because I love talking to people about the map, because then it grows. Every time you talk to somebody, it grows further. And let me just quickly show, I'm not going to get into the map totally, but I will say that within this ecosystem, some of the patterns that start to emerge, there is this receiving cities part of it, or receiving communities element. And there's also disaster, basically resilient disaster part of the ecosystem. How do you make sure that that people who are displaced but come back, that their lives don't fall apart when they come back, et cetera. And then there's the managed retreat part of the ecosystem, which is really the oldest and the best funded part of the ecosystem. But anyway, we could spend all day on that. And so as we think about how to accelerate and support the ecosystem, I've identified some initial sort of acceleration ideas. And these are not, in stone in the least. They're just a place to start and have that conversation with different actors in the ecosystem. But one is, if we're trying to encourage cities, and that means not just the municipality, but all of cities to support this work, finding those cities is important. And then developing local models or finding local models, and then sort of looking into them as Hannah has done with Worcester. She didn't create that model, but she researched it, which is what's needed, what needs to be done. So supporting local pilots or local models is one step that I think is important. And Cincinnati is an example of that in action. There's also city networks that can be supportive. So ICLEI is forming a cohort of cities that want to work on climate mobility. Welcoming America may also do that. We're talking with Mayor's Migration Council, who may also do that collaboratively. There are ways to scale these things through city networks. That's often, on climate resilience, that's really a big way that's scaled through different cities, for example. Ecosystem organizing, bringing actors the way adaptation leader is today, supporting that ecosystem organizing, and also bringing people together that might not have come together otherwise. That's part of a strategy of accelerating the ecosystem. Multi-sector, multi-level infrastructure investments. That's trying to say, okay, the city wants to do this. How do we get federal funds to help, state funds to help, local funding to help, private donor, private, corporations or commercial real estate firms that see opportunity. How do we bring resources in from all levels to support these cities to really build comprehensive infrastructure? And then eventually developing frameworks, which is also something that adaptation leaders working on, which is, okay, if a city wants to do this or a community wants to do this, what are the best practices? What are the policies that they should enact? There are no solid and field approved frameworks yet, and any framework has to adopt over time. But by creating those frameworks, I'm seeing as an important step. And so just to end, part of that, again, I talked about this modeling and creating these types of pilots or supporting modeling and piloting that's already happening, just to do that within different archetypes. And we've talked about those archetypes. These are Anna Morandi's definitions. There's different archetype models out there. But for her, and I think it's a useful one, she's an urban planner and was at the National League of Cities, is going to be working with Ollie in Cincinnati. Destination cities is part of that. How do we have models for places that are, the quote unquote more safe? We talked about that already, but those are different models maybe than, say, receiving cities that are still in harm's way to a greater extent, but closer to the source, maybe like Orlando in Florida as an example. And then finally, more vulnerable cities themselves. How do you help Los Angeles or other cities that suffer from these horrible disasters to make sure the recovery is really equitable? And how do you help them plan before it happens, which is a much better way of doing things. So that's all. And thank you so much for your time. And if anyone wants copies of the map or anything else, that's my email. Thanks, everybody.
So we're 10 minutes into the networking lunch hour, but it would be a pity to waste the brilliance that we have here up on the panel. So let me just say that for lunch, for the organizers and presenters, there are box lunches that are sitting outside in the lobby. For everyone else, we're a block away from a food court in 2000 Pennsylvania. So it's literally around the corner. But let's, at the risk of eating into lunch, no pun intended, let's take time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are any for the panel. Yes.
So I had a lot of thoughts, but since we don't have time, I'll just stick with my one question. So, you're focusing a lot, I saw especially this sort of Leo. So you talked a lot about the Great Lakes and some of these climate haven cities and getting them prepared. So, I live in North Carolina. For decades, Asheville has been identified as a climate haven, and it was completely destroyed by Hurricane Helene. I always mess up that name. So, I think about places like, Duluth. I'm from Minnesota. I can understand why people don't want to go there. But, the Great Lakes has a climate problem. Many. Harmful algal blooms are one example of things that are causing massive deaths because of climate change, which will increase. I won't say massive deaths, but it's causing lots of risk, and things are, pretty scary to go up there. agricultural production in the Midwest causes a lot of release of environmental toxins into the environment. And they're doing that primarily because they're trying to create, a food-safe environment that's secure against climate change. So the idea that we can create climate havens or identify specific cities as safe, is that a false narrative? Is that something that we really should be thinking about? Or is this really just repackaging the idea that cities in general need to be more climate ready? Which I totally agree with that argument. But I think identifying climate havens, I'm not sure if that argument is really something that we could sell anymore.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think that, Hannah, you spoke about this a little bit in your presentation. I think that there's a bit of a binary narrative emerging of a place that is a climate haven or not, when in fact, different places are at differing risks for different types of climate impacts. And a lot of the time, back to the point I'd made about inadequate disclosure of climate risks, there's not a disclosure of the type of risk that a place is at risk for. Taking Asheville, for example, when you look at the FEMA climate resilience maps, Asheville gets an overall mark of being very climate safe. But when you drill down, just one click down, and you look at the different types of climate risks, and you look at riverine flood risk, Asheville is at very high risk of riverine flooding, and that's precisely what happened in Asheville and what devastated that community. But that fact is not known, and less than 1% of homeowners in Asheville had flood insurance. And so I think that, I do think that a place like Duluth is, probably overall more climate resilient than a place like Houston, but to your point, I think we need to understand the types of climate risks that a place has, and that's kind of part of that planning of how do you integrate that into your climate resilience planning.
And I'll just add to that. I'm from Vermont. My hometown has flooded 2 years in a row at a massive scale, so I completely appreciate where you're coming from there. And I think it's important to back up and understand what risk is, right? Risk is a Venn diagram between exposure and vulnerability. And the closer those two circles are together, the higher the risk. And so there are two ways to address that. You can lower your exposure. Some places naturally have less exposure. Or you can reduce your vulnerability by taking proactive action. And that proactive action is what we're going to see from a lot of these major cities. From a commercial real estate standpoint, places like New York City, yes, highly exposed, but also really high adaptive capacity. And from an investment standpoint, that sort of density is a good thing for commercial real estate. They feel safe investing because they feel confident that there is going to be enough public investment in reducing the vulnerability that the exposure will be less risk. So I think it's just a balancing act of those two pieces.
Do we have another question?
One question. Might not have that much time to go over this, but going back to your climate gentrification, have you looked at the upside of climate gentrification, particularly as kind of a pull factor? And then if you consider that everybody wants to live or many people want to live in a climate gentrified community, is there a way to kind of move people from a climate gentrifying community to another climate gentrifying area, but it's theirs? So it's like sort of a mix of positive gentrification as well as negative.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And absolutely, gentrification isn't a bad thing. Displacement is,
yeah,
right? And so how do we get the gentrification without the displacement? And I think it really comes to being proactive and making sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable. Because when we have seen across anything that we do, right? When we first center the most vulnerable populations, everyone else also benefits.
Isn't there also kind of a manage retreat component? Like you displace people to a climate gentrified place. So you basically say, we will give you the wealth to live in a nicer community. Is that, basically have a gentrified place, take the marginal community and move them to a place where they will be equally well off.
Why did they have to be the ones to move to benefit, though? Right?
That's a very good point. agree,
Because
I'm just being
I think
provocative.
that, you know, the gentrification piece means that there is economic development coming into your community. And ideally, you benefit from that. And if you choose to leave because you want to sell your house because you've had it in your home, your family for generations and you can make a lot of money, that's fine. That's your prerogative. But if you want to be able to stay, you shouldn't be displaced by things like higher property taxes.
Absolutely. Just looking at the nuances of the different shades of, people might want to move to a nicer community than they can afford where they are, for example. I don't know.
And just to add to all of that, I would say climate gentrification and any kind of change to what you love about your community. There's the statistical change that's happening, and then there's the perception of what's happening. And again, dealing with Welcoming America with communities that were having, somewhat large influxes of migrants, but still not that big. And so the statistics weren't huge, but the fear was huge. And so you want to deal with the actual gentrification, but you also want to deal with fear of change and fear of demographic change, whether it's people coming at whatever level of the socioeconomic part. You need to have a strategy to actually, if you're not educating the community about the people who are coming, if you're not building bridges between newcomers and longtime residents, the fear will, whatever change comes, the fear will happen. And with fear comes bad policies and not welcoming communities. So I think both are important.
Well, we're now down to 40 minutes for our hour-long lunch. I want to thank our excellent panel one more time.